day 36. Kiev is still held by the Ukrainians. President Zelensky has come out and said that Russia's invasion is at a turning point. But given what's happening on the ground, do you think it is a turning point?
Well, the short answer is no. I think language is key here. Although Kiev, clearly there's an operational pause around Kiev for the fighting, but fighting is continuing in the Donbass region. Which
is over here. Let's just circle that so we know where that is.
And it's very, very determined fighting. And likewise in Mariupol down to the south. It's pretty obvious that phase one of Russia's plan didn't go entirely according to plan. But I think we must never forget that Russia is a global superpower with 10 times the size of resources. Whilst Zelensky's language may well be there to raise morale of his troops, there's also no doubt that Ukraine is still in a very difficult situation, and we've yet to see phase two of Russia's plan kick in.
Well, talking of phase two, Russia's deputy defense minister has said there's going to be reduced military activity around Kiev and Chernihiv. But we have seen, let me get that, we've seen attacks on Chernihiv, haven't we? So what do they mean by reduced military activity?
Well, first of all, I would be extremely cynical about any Russian statement about their tactics. You do not tell your enemy what you're about to do. One of the most effective ways of prosecuting war is through deception, and history is littered with that. So I think we have to take any statement with a large pinch of salt. But it may be that because of the situation around Kiev, part of this is the Russians making a virtue out of necessity, because the reality is they've got forces that are stalled, and therefore, both sides do not want to see Kiev end up the same way as Mariupol, flattened. So it looks like the Russians' priority is across the Donbass and to the south, and therefore, by liberating troops, by adopting a more defensive posture, you need significantly fewer resources to do defence than you do offence, would allow them to re-brigade their resources. That doesn't mean you stop fighting. You still fire mortars, you still fire rockets, you still fire artillery, because you still want to keep the enemy's head down. It does provide, though, the Ukrainians the opportunity, because now that the forces are static, the Ukrainians can now mount counterattacks. And I think we've been seeing a little bit more of that. The challenge with the Donbass, unfortunately, if you remember the resupply convoy for Kyiv, 40-mile convoy, real problems for Russia. In the Donbass region, they don't have those problems. You're right on the Russian border, so resupplying fuel, people, ammunition would make life a lot easier for the Russians, and, of course, also make it a lot more difficult for the Ukrainians.
Now, the head of GCHQ has been speaking in Australia overnight and has said that Putin massively misjudged his own capabilities, and that his advisors, because the situation is so dire, they're simply not telling him the truth. Do you think that he did misjudge the capabilities, and do you think those people are not telling Putin what the real story is on the ground?
Well, I think there can be little doubt that Putin's initial ambition of just walking in and being welcomed over 48 hours was folly. So there's no doubt that they didn't game this properly. In the West, when we're doing any of these sorts of scales of operations, there's an intense planning period. For the invasion of Iraq, you get military leadership, they train, they practice, they look at courses of action, what's the most dangerous, what's the most likely, and then you have a very animated conversation between the senior leadership and the political masters to make sure everybody understands the risks involved. And then you do lots of training to make sure your troops are ready. It's pretty evident none of the troops were ready for this, the logistics supply wasn't ready for this, and they didn't really have a plan B. So for Putin, who speaks truth to power? How does Putin engage with that process rather than just having a bunch of yes men charging around? In the West, as Churchill famously described democracy as the least worst option, but we do have the press, we have the people, we have the military and the politicians all engaged in a very animated conversation, so that when people go across and start a campaign, they're ready and they understand what happens when the plan doesn't survive contact. It's pretty evident that's not the case. I think the irony of all of this, of course, is that Putin, the one thing he was seeking to avoid is what's coming to him. He was seeking to avoid Ukrainian resurgence of their nationalism. Also, NATO is much stronger and more coherent, and likewise the impact long-term on his economy. Not what he would have expected.
When Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine, is this what he planned? The wholesale destruction of swathes of Ukrainian cities? Entire units of his military wiped out, their weapons destroyed or handed over. Not according to British and American officials today, who say his ill-advised Ukrainian misadventure has ended in abject failure.
In many ways, Putin has already lost. Far from being the far-sighted manipulator of events that he would have us believe, Putin has damaged himself through a series of catastrophic misjudgments. He allowed himself to be misled as to his own strength, including the effectiveness of the Russian armed forces.
But if Putin is losing so badly, he's showing little sign of remorse. Fresh attacks in Kiev give the lie to Russian claims they're scaling down their offensive there. And NATO says they are pulling back, only to fight elsewhere.
Russia is not withdrawing its forces, but repositioning them, and that we can expect a reinforced Russian military effort in the Donbas region. So Russia continues to pursue a military outcome of this conflict.
Western spies and commanders have put out a coordinated message today that Vladimir Putin has made a huge blunder by invading Ukraine, but his commanders are too scared to tell him the extent of it. If that is true, he may well only double down with a war that could have even more devastating consequences for civilians. Putin went on the offensive economically today, demanding the West buys Russian gas in rubles, a threat that may end up with supplies being cut to Europe.
In order to buy Russian natural gas, they have to open ruble accounts in Russian banks. From these accounts, they'll be paying for Russian gas, which will be delivered from tomorrow, 1st of April of this year. If such payments are not made, we will consider this as a failure to carry out the commitments, with all the consequences. We don't get anything free of charge, and we're not going to engage in charity either.
The latest drone pictures of Mariupol, these taken by a Russian journalist, are staggering. A European seaside city being torn apart, building by Russian bombing and shelling. A failure or not, Russia's leader remains defiant, with yet more mindless, futile destruction only likely to follow.
El presidente ruso Vladimir Putin ha firmado este jueves un decreto que permite reclutar a más de 130.000 personas adicionales para sumarse al ejército en plena guerra con Ucrania. Según señala el decreto, desde el 1 de abril al 15 de julio se permitirá el reclutamiento de ciudadanos de edades comprendidas entre los 18 y 27 años que no se encuentran en la reserva y sean sujetos al reclutamiento para el servicio militar de acuerdo con la ley rusa. Según el documento al que ha tenido acceso la agencia de noticias Interfax, indica que esto afectará a 134.500 personas. Asimismo, el presidente ha informado de que estará permitido retirarse del ejército a todos aquellos militares, marinos y sargentos cuyo mandato en el servicio militar haya expirado. En este sentido, ha instado al Gobierno y las comisiones implicadas a garantizar la implantación de estas medidas ante el aumento de la tensión a raíz de la invasión rusa del territorio ucraniano.
Rosa, y abrimos esta sección de revista de prensa con una información de la inteligencia británica que ha llenado los titulares internacionales. Nos fijamos entonces en el medio, The Guardian y el The Sydney Morning Herald.
Buenos días, Raúl. Exacto, una información que se complementa con lo que decías, ¿no? Informaciones también avanzadas por la inteligencia estadounidense. Pero concretamente, The Guardian se fija en esta información británica con el siguiente titular. Los consejeros de Putin tienen miedo de decirle la verdad sobre el error de Ucrania, según el jefe de la GCHQ, que es una agencia de inteligencia británica. Bien, el jefe de esta agencia, Jeremy Fleming, avanzó estas informaciones en un discurso en Canberra, en Australia. Y cuando se refiere a error en Ucrania, se refiere a un error estratégico que ya se ha comentado también por activa y por pasiva a lo largo de este mes largo de invasión, que consiste en que Putin habría subestimado la resistencia ucraniana, la respuesta occidental, y también habría sobrevalorado, ¿no?, la facilidad de una rápida victoria rusa. Bien, este artículo de The Guardian cita al jefe de esta agencia británica de inteligencia, que dice que se ha convertido esto en una guerra personal de Putin, que están pagando el precio de esta, digamos, de ese atrevimiento los ucranianos inocentes y los rusos de a pie en el marco de la economía rusa. Y dice que la realidad, sin embargo, de este fracaso, a pesar de que Putin esté aislado, debe ser clara, ¿no?, para el Kremlin, que han debido pues ya darse cuenta de que les está costando más de lo previsto pues ganar esta guerra en Ucrania. Algo en lo que coincide, como decíamos, la inteligencia de Estados Unidos, que dice que como consecuencia de este aislamiento, insiste, Putin estaría dando órdenes a ciegas a su ejército. Y particularmente en esto se fija este medio australiano, el Sydney Morning Herald, que dice que el ejército ruso estaría pues bajo de moral y escaso de armamento. Y cita una información que avanzó el jefe de esta agencia británica en este discurso en la capital australiana, y es que hay soldados que se niegan a cumplir las órdenes del Kremlin, que sabotean su equipamiento e incluso derribaron un avión ruso. Da constancia de que Fleming, sin embargo, no aportó pruebas de este derribamiento de un avión ruso por parte de las propias tropas rusas, pero que, sin embargo, consultaron con el Ministerio de Defensa de Londres, que aseguró que estaban suficientemente convencidos de esta información como para permitir que este jefe del espionaje británico pues la dijera abiertamente en público, ¿no?, en este discurso. Pero, Raúl, cabe destacar que esto no deja de ser la estrategia que ha venido usando Occidente desde el inicio de esta guerra, ¿no? Dar públicamente las informaciones que se obtienen a través de la inteligencia occidental para, digamos, mostrar, evidenciar pues, los defectos, ¿no?, del enemigo. Pero ya ha salido el portavoz de la presidencia, Dmitry Peskov, de la presidencia rusa, a decir que estas informaciones son falsas, que es falso que Putin esté mal informado. Y, Raúl, aquí pues llegamos a la conclusión de que si tan aislado estuviera Putin, pues no serviría de nada que se hicieran públicas estas informaciones, ¿no? No le harían daño al Kremlin.
Rosa, vamos rápido porque el tiempo es corto y tenemos mucho de qué hablar. A pesar de todo, la popularidad del presidente Putin no baja, sino todo lo contrario, ¿no?
De eso exactamente nos informa el Wall Street Journal con una información de Evan Gershkovich. Y es que en el último mes la popularidad del presidente ruso habría pasado del 71% al 83%, esto según la organización Levada Center, que en teoría es una organización independiente, de hecho considerada como agente extranjero por el Kremlin. Ahora sí hay que poner entre comillas esta supuesta independencia más todavía en el contexto actual. Nos recuerda este artículo que este índice de popularidad del 83% Putin no lo alcanzaba desde la anexión de Crimea en 2014. Y por otro lado, este texto también nos dice que también ha incrementado la gente que piensa que el país va en la buena dirección, que en enero era de un 50%, en febrero de un 52% y ahora el 69% de los rusos consideran pues, que Rusia, digamos, va en buen camino.